The myth of the American gangster is often defined by invisible boundaries, by unspoken rules understood across enemy lines, territory, profit margins, operational respect. But there was one boundary, forged not in concrete or contract, but in blood and memory, that was considered truly sacred, absolutely inviolable throughout the entire underworld of the East Coast, regardless of color or creed. You did not, under any circumstances, touch a man's mother. The penalty for this specific transgression was not merely death, it was erasure. It was the complete, violent excision of your existence from the fabric of reality, followed by the quiet termination of every single person who ever knew your name, whispered your location, or benefited from your breath. In the early 1970s, atop the chaotic, shimmering mountain of the New York drug trade, Frank Lucas sat alone. He wasn't merely successful, he was an anomaly, a golden ghost operating above and around the established frameworks of organized crime. Lucas had engineered the direct pipeline of blue magic, bypassing the Italian-American syndicates entirely, bringing pure product, straight from Southeast Asia, into the veins of Harlem, making him exponentially wealthier, exponentially more powerful, and perhaps most dangerously, exponentially more untouchable than any street boss the five families could still claim. He moved with a cold precision that lacked the theatrical bravado of the old dons. His power was silent, absolute, and rooted in the unwavering loyalty of men who knew he could provide both unprecedented riches and equally unprecedented protection. Frank Lucas, however, kept his personal life meticulously separate from his professional empire. His mother, Eva Lucas, a pillar of his early, humble life in North Carolina, still existed in a world untouched by the gilded excess and casual brutality of her son's reality. She lived simply, maintained routines, and, despite Frank offering chauffeur-driven armored cars and private security deals, she retained a fierce independence, often insisting on the simple, mundane necessity of taking the bus to run errands or visit friends in the neighborhood near the border of Spanish Harlem and the Upper East Side, a zone always teeming with the friction between old and new power. It was in this tenuous, congested urban canyon, on a dreary Tuesday afternoon in October 1971, that the ancient laws of the street were shattered by a moment of arrogant, blinding stupidity. The man who committed this unforgivable act was Carmine the Viper Rossi. Rossi was not a primary boss, he was a captain in the Genovese family, a man whose relevance was fading along with the rest of his generation's grip on the city's true profits. Carmine carried the weight of a dying legacy, a sense of entitlement bred from decades of undisputed territory control, an entitlement that had failed to recognize the seismic shift occurring directly beneath his feet. He saw Frank Lucas's operation as an affront, a crude hijacking of sacred white enterprise, and he viewed Harlem as little more than a necessary cesspool for consumption. Rossi and two of his heavy-handed enforcers, Mickey the Chin Calabrese and Joey the Knife Mancini, were shaking down a small, independent grocery owner who dared to operate without their protection. The shakedown was loud, aggressive, and predictably clumsy. It spilled out onto the sidewalk, directly adjacent to a weathered metal bench at the bus stop on the corner of 110th Street and Lexington Avenue, where Eva Lucas sat, patiently waiting for the M1001 bus, clutching a small, worn leather handbag and a shopping list. Eva Lucas, nearing 70, was slight but possessed the steel resolve often found in women who had raised powerful men from poverty. She tried to ignore the disturbance, focusing on the distant rumble of traffic. But Rossi, fueled by cheap whiskey and the frustration of diminishing returns, needed an audience for his performance of dominance. The incident began not with aggression aimed at her, but with an escalating volume and the proximity of the violence. A young mother, trying to shepherd her child past the confrontation, stumbled slightly, bumping Carmine Rossi's elbow. Rossi roared, turning his frustration outward. His eyes, burning with petulant rage, landed momentarily on Eva Lucas, the silent observer who seemed to disapprove of the entire spectacle with her sheer presence. "What the hell are you looking at, old woman?" Rossi spat, his voice thick with entitlement. Eva Lucas did not flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly, her expression remaining one of placid, resolute calm. In her gaze, there was pity for a man who had to resort to such noise to assert authority. That pity, that absolute lack of fear or respect, was what finally snapped the thin wire of Carmine Rossi's self-control. To him, she was just an old, black woman in Harlem, an irrelevant cipher, an extra in his scene. He saw an easy, defenseless target to vent his structural frustration. He needed to prove, right then and there, that the old power still commanded fear. He stepped closer, the stench of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne assaulting. "I asked you something, you deaf old broad." Before Mickey or Joey could register the sheer stupidity of their captain's impending action, before they could even process that this specific, humble woman might be someone's mother, Carmine Rossi, in a swift, reckless motion born of utter contempt, raised his open palm and delivered a sharp, cracking slap across Eva Lucas's cheek. The sound, they would later recall, was impossibly loud. It cut through the city's din, echoing the sudden, horrifying silence that immediately followed. Eva Lucas's head snapped sideways. She stumbled backward, not falling, but catching herself quickly against the bus shelter's corrugated metal side. Her small handbag fell to the pavement, its contents scattering: a faded coin purse, a small Bible, reading glasses, and a single photograph of a young Frank in his military uniform. Rossi, already feeling the first cold tendrils of regret the moment his hand made contact, looked around frantically. His crew, Mickey and Joey, instinctively grabbed him, their faces pale. "Carmine, what the hell? We gotta go, now!" They scrambled into their idling black Cadillac and sped away, leaving Eva Lucas standing alone at the bus stop, the red imprint of Rossi's hand already blossoming on her dark cheek, like a brand of dishonor in the heart of the territory her son commanded. She did not cry. She simply reached up and touched the throbbing heat on her skin, then slowly bent down to gather her scattered belongings, her hands trembling, not with fear, but with a profound, chilling sense of violation. An elderly man, who had witnessed everything from across the street, rushed over. "Ma'am, are you all right? Should I call the police?" Eva Lucas looked at him with eyes that had suddenly aged another decade. "No police," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the shock. "But could you please help me find a phone? I need to call my son." The news did not travel by traditional means. The streets of Harlem were Frank Lucas's sensory network, his intelligence apparatus more effective than any wiretap or surveillance team the FBI could mount. But the call that mattered came directly from his mother, her voice calm, but carrying an undertone that Frank had never heard before, a subtle fracture in the bedrock of his world. The information reached Frank Lucas approximately 18 minutes after the incident. He was, at that moment, sitting in his immaculate, soundproofed penthouse office in a building on 145th Street, reviewing ledgers with his accountant and discussing the logistics of a shipment arriving in Newark. The room was heavy with the smell of expensive Cuban tobacco and new leather. Frank was dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit, radiating the calm authority of a CEO. The call came through on his private line. Frank answered immediately when he saw it was from the payphone near his mother's building. "Mama!" His voice was soft, concerned. "Frank, baby," Eva said, and he could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "I'm all right, but something happened today. A white man with two others. They were causing trouble at the grocery, and when I looked at them, he struck me, Frank, right there at the bus stop on 110th. Frank Lucas did not move. His hand gripping the telephone receiver turned white at the knuckle. His eyes, usually warm and alert, went instantly flat, becoming the eyes of a predator who has smelled blood. "Mama, did you see his face? Did he say his name?" His voice was barely a whisper, yet every word was carved from ice. "I heard one of the others call him Carmine. They drove away in a black Cadillac. Frank, I don't want you to—" "Mama," Frank interrupted gently, "I need you to go to Aunt Sarah's house, right now. Don't go home. I'm sending Red Top to pick you up in 5 minutes. You'll stay with Sarah until I tell you it's safe. Understand? Frank, please don't—" "Mama, I love you. I'll call you tonight. Now go wait for Red Top." He hung up the phone with the delicate precision of a man defusing a bomb. The accountant, sensing the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere, quietly gathered his papers and left without a word. Frank sat motionless for exactly 3 minutes, his mind cycling through every possible response, calculating trajectories, weighing consequences. This wasn't a business dispute. This wasn't about territory or product. This was personal desecration. This was a violation of the only pure, innocent thing left in his complicated, blood-soaked life. When he finally moved, it was with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. He pressed the intercom button. "JD, get in here, now, and call Sticky, Red, and the Professor. Tell them it's Code Black." J.D. Williams, Frank's chief lieutenant and most trusted advisor, entered the office within 60 seconds. He was a former Army intelligence officer, a man whose calm demeanor and strategic mind had helped Lucas build an empire. One look at Frank's face told him everything he needed to know. Someone had crossed the ultimate line. "What happened, boss?" Frank explained in clinical detail, his voice never rising, never cracking. When he finished, JD's face had gone pale. "Carmine Rossi," JD said immediately. "Genovese captain. Operates out of a social club on Pleasant Avenue. Runs numbers, protection. Some loan sharking in East Harlem and the Bronx. Crew of about 6 regular guys. Mickey Calabrese and Joey Mancini are his top enforcers. There's also Paulie the Hammer Torino, Sal Big Ears Benedetto, Tommy 2 times Greco, and a driver named Frankie Batts." Frank nodded slowly. JD always had the intelligence ready. That's why he was invaluable. "I want complete surveillance on all of them within the hour. Not street kids with binoculars. I want professionals. I want to know where they eat, where they sleep, where they shit. I want to know the names of their wives, their girlfriends, their favorite bartenders, everything." "Boss, you know if we move on a maid guy..." "JD," Frank interrupted, his voice dropping to a register that made the air feel thinner. "He put his hands on my mother, in public, on my territory. There is no negotiation here. There is no discussion. What I'm about to do isn't revenge. It's a lesson. We're not just eliminating Carmine Rossi. We're eliminating the very concept that anyone, anywhere, can disrespect my family and continue to draw breath." JD swallowed hard. He'd seen Frank angry, but seen him order violent retribution against rivals and traitors. But this was different. This was the cold, calculated fury of a man who had just watched his entire moral universe pivot on a single, unforgivable. "What's the play?" JD asked quietly. Frank stood, walking to the massive window overlooking Harlem. His empire spread out before him in the fading afternoon light. "Rossi's crew operates from the Ravenite Social Club on Pleasant Avenue, correct?" "Yes, sir. They follow patterns. Old-school mob guys always do. Same restaurants, same clubs, same schedules. That's their weakness. They think tradition makes them strong, but it makes them predictable." Frank turned back to face JD, and in that moment, JD saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A man who had just made the decision to step beyond the boundaries of conventional criminal warfare into something far more terrifying. "I'm not sending a message with bullets and blood, JD. That's what they'd expect. That's the language they understand. No, I'm going to make Carmine Rossi and his entire crew simply disappear. Not killed in a shootout, not found floating in the Hudson. Disappeared, as if the earth opened up and swallowed them whole." "Boss, I know what it is," Frank said quietly. "It's unprecedented. It's going to scare the living hell out of the 5 families. But that's exactly the point. After tonight, everyone in this city, Italian, Irish, Puerto Rican, doesn't matter. Everyone will know that Frank Lucas's family is absolutely, completely, eternally untouchable. The price for forgetting that won't be death. It'll be something far worse. It'll be the kind of disappearance that leaves families wondering for generations." JD took a deep breath. "I'll need the professor and his team." The professor was the codename for Harold Washington, a former Navy SEAL and demolitions expert who had served 2 tours in Vietnam. After the war, unable to readjust to civilian life, he'd found purpose working for Frank Lucas. The professor didn't lead a street crew. He led what Frank privately called the Ghost Unit, a small team of 4 former military specialists who handled operations that required absolute precision and 0 evidence. "Get him," Frank confirmed. "Tell him the target is 7 men, all connected to Rossi. I want them taken simultaneously tonight, not killed on the street, extracted, silently, professionally, then transported to the facility in Red Hook." JD understood immediately. The facility was a warehouse Lucas owned under a shell corporation, a place that officially didn't exist on any city records. It had been used exactly twice before, both times for interrogations of high-value targets who subsequently vanished without a trace. "Timeline?" JD asked. "Rossi and his crew usually gather at the social club around 8 p.m. for dinner and cards. They stay until midnight, sometimes later, but they arrive separately. That's when we take them. Between 7:30 and 8:15, each one will be alone, vulnerable, predictable. The professor's team will intercept them one by one before they reach the club. Mickey Calabrese always stops at the newsstand on 116th. Joey Mancini picks up cannoli at Veniero's. The others have their routines too. We've been watching them for months." "You've been planning for this?" JD asked, surprised. "Not this specifically," Frank admitted, "but I always knew that eventually someone would be stupid enough to challenge me in a way that demanded a response beyond conventional warfare. I've been preparing for that possibility since the day I bypassed the mob's heroin supply chain. Rossi just happened to be the first idiot to pull the trigger." At exactly 7:32 p.m., Mickey, The Chin Calabrese walked to his favorite newsstand on the corner of 116th and 1st Avenue, the same newsstand he'd visited every evening for the past 12 years. He purchased a racing form and a pack of Pall Malls, exchanged the same jokes with the vendor, and turned to walk the 3 blocks to the Ravenite Social Club. He never made it past the alley between the newsstand and the dry clean. 2 men emerged from the shadows with the silent efficiency of hunting cats. One delivered a precise strike to the back of Mickey's knee, collapsing him instantly. Before he could cry out, a chloroform-soaked cloth was clamped over his mouth and nose. Within 8 seconds, Mickey Calabrese was unconscious, his body caught and dragged into a waiting van with tinted windows and no license plate. The entire operation took 11 seconds. The newsstand vendor never looked up from his register. At 7:39 p.m., Joey the Knife Mancini walked out of Veniero's pasticceria carrying a white box of fresh cannoli, the same dessert he brought to the social club every Tuesday, without fail. He was whistling, thinking about the poker game ahead, completely unaware that his routine had been mapped, studied, and weaponized against him. As he reached for the door handle of his Buick Riviera, he felt a sharp pinch in his neck, so quick and precise, he barely registered it. His vision blurred, his legs buckled. Strong hands caught him, guided him into the back seat of his own car. By the time his brain processed what was happening, he was already unconscious, and his car was being driven not to the social club, but to a warehouse in Red Hook. One by one, the members of Carmine Rossi's crew were extracted from the streets of New York with the cold precision of a military operation. Paulie, the Hammer Torino, was taken from his mistress's apartment building in Astoria. Sal Big Ears Benedetto vanished from the parking lot behind his favorite trattoria. Tommy 2 times Greco never made it out of the barbershop where he got his weekly shave. Frankie Batts, the driver, was intercepted in the parking garage beneath his own apartment. By 8:05 p.m., 6 members of Carmine Rossi's crew had simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. No witnesses, no struggles, no gunshots, just 6 men following their routines, and then nothing. Carmine Rossi himself was the final target. At 8:12 p.m., Carmine pulled his black Cadillac into the narrow alley behind the Ravenite Social Club, the same spot he'd parked for 15 years. The routine was sacred. Park in the alley, enter through the back door, check in with whoever arrived first, then settle in for dinner and cards. Tonight, the alley was darker than usual. The streetlight that normally illuminated the entrance had been systematically disabled 2 hours earlier by a man with a pellet gun and excellent aim. Carmine stepped out of his Cadillac, keys jingling in his hand, and immediately sensed something wrong. The usual sounds of the city seemed muted, distant. The air felt heavy, charged with an electricity he couldn't quite identify. Before he could process the danger, 3 figures emerged from the shadows, not street thugs with guns, but professionals in dark clothing, moving with military precision. Carmine's hand went for the .38 snub-nose in his waistband, but he never reached it. The lead operative moved with impossible speed, delivering a precise strike to Carmine's wrist that sent the gun clattering across the pavement. A second operative swept Carmine's legs, dropping him hard onto the asphalt. Before Carmine could scream, a third operative pressed a taser to his ribs, not enough to kill, but enough to ensure total compliance. As Carmine's consciousness faded, the last thing he saw was the face of the lead operative, completely expressionless, holding up a small photograph. Even through his blurring vision, Carmine recognized the image. It was the photograph that had fallen from Eva Lucas's handbag at the bus stop, the photograph of a young Frank Lucas in his military. "This is from Frank," the operative said quietly. "He wanted you to know exactly why this is happening." Then darkness swallowed Carmine Rossi whole. The warehouse in Red Hook was a monument to industrial decay. Corrugated metal walls, broken windows covered with plywood, surrounded by other abandoned buildings that created a perfect sound barrier. Inside, the space had been meticulously prepared. 7 chairs bolted to the concrete floor, arranged in a circle. High-powered work lights created an interrogation-style brightness. The air smelled of rust, motor oil, and the faint, sour tang of fear. By 9:00 p.m., all 7 members of Carmine Rossi's crew were seated, bound with military-grade zip ties, their heads covered with black hoods. They had regained consciousness approximately 20 minutes earlier, and the psychological warfare had already begun, not through torture, but through silence and anticipation. Not a single word had been spoken to them. They had no idea where they were, who had taken them, or what was coming next. Frank Lucas arrived at 9:15 p.m., dressed in the same tailored suit he'd worn that afternoon. looking more like a corporate executive than a drug kingpin, orchestrating the systematic erasure of 7 men. He was accompanied only by JD, who carried a small leather briefcase. Frank stood in the center of the circle, surveying the hooded figures like a general inspecting captured enemy soldiers. He nodded to the professor, who stood in the shadows near the door. One by one, the hoods were removed. The 7 men blinked against the harsh light, their eyes adjusting, their minds racing to process their situation. When they saw Frank Lucas standing before them, the terror was immediate and absolute. They weren't stupid. They knew exactly why they were here. Carmine Rossi, seated directly across from Frank, tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, despite the zip ties cutting into his wrists. "Lucas," Rossi rasped, his voice hoarse, "you're making a mistake. I'm a made man. The family will—" "The family," Frank interrupted quietly, "will do absolutely nothing." He began to walk slowly around the circle, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "Do you know why they'll do nothing, Carmine? Because by tomorrow morning, the official story will be that you and your crew got ambitious, tried to muscle in on Gambino territory, and were dealt with accordingly. The Genovese family will quietly wash their hands of you, grateful to avoid a war. The Gambinos will accept the credit for removing a problem, and you, all of you, will simply be gone. No bodies to bury, no widows to compensate, just gone." Mickey, the chin Calabresi, his face pale and sweating, found his voice. "Frank, we didn't know. We didn't know that was your mother. Carmine didn't—" "You stood there and watched," Frank said, his voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge sharp enough to cut steel. "You watched a 70-year-old woman get struck in the face by your boss, and you did nothing to stop it. You helped him escape. That makes you complicit." He stopped in front of Carmine Rossi. "You put your hands on my mother, in public, on my territory. That single act violated every rule, every code, every understanding that keeps this world from descending into absolute chaos. The only reason men like us can operate, the only reason we can build empire and maintain power, is because we agree on certain boundaries. Family, especially mothers, has always been the most sacred boundary." Carmine Rossi, his face ashen, tried one last gambit. "Frank, please. I'll make it right. I'll apologize to your mother personally. I'll pay tribute." "Name your price." "There is no price," Frank said, cutting him off. "There is no negotiation. There is no apology sufficient for what you did. What you did requires a response so severe, so absolute, that no one, and I mean no one, will ever make the same mistake again." Frank nodded to JD, who opened the leather briefcase and removed 7 small vials, each containing a clear liquid. "This," Frank continued, "is a chemical compound developed by military researchers during the war. It's untraceable, breaks down completely within hours, and mimics natural causes. In about 30 minutes, each of you will experience what feels like a heart attack. Your bodies will shut down peacefully, without pain, and then you'll be transported to a location where you'll never be found." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Joey the Knife Mancini beginning to weep. "But before that happens," Frank said, walking back to the center of the circle, "I want you to understand something. This isn't revenge. Revenge is emotional, irrational, satisfying only in the moment. This is something far more important. This is a lesson. Your deaths will create a void in the underworld, a story that will be whispered about for generations. People will wonder what happened to Carmine Rossi and his crew. They'll speculate, theorize, create myths. But the truth, the simple, terrible truth, is that you forgot the most basic rule. You don't touch a man's mother." Carmine Rossi, all pretense of dignity abandoned, began to plead. "Frank, please. I have kids. I have a wife. They need—" "My mother," Frank interrupted, his voice finally rising, carrying real anger for the first time, "is a 70-year-old woman who spent her entire life working menial jobs to raise her children. She never hurt anyone. She never involved herself in my business. And you struck her in the face like she was nothing because you needed to feel powerful for 5 seconds." Frank leaned down, looking Carmine directly in the eyes. "Your children will grow up without a father. Your wife will become a widow. Your name will become a cautionary tale. And every time someone in this city even thinks about disrespecting Frank Lucas or his family, they'll remember what happened to you. They'll remember that you disappeared so completely that even your shadow is—" Frank straightened, nodding to the professor. "Proceed." What happened next was clinical, efficient, and absolutely final. The professor and his team administered the injections with the precision of medical professionals. One by one, the members of Carmine Rossi's crew slumped in their chairs, their consciousness fading, their lives ending not with violence, but with the quiet, inexorable shutdown of their biological function. Carmine Rossi was the last to receive the injection. As the needle pierced his skin, Frank Lucas leaned down one final time. "The last thing I want you to know," Frank whispered, "is that my mother is safe, surrounded by family, and will never think about you again. But everyone else in this city will. Goodbye, Carmine." By 10:30 p.m., the warehouse was empty, except for the professor and his team, who began the meticulous process of cleanup and disposal. The 7 bodies would be transported to a location no one else knew, a place prepared months in advance for exactly this purpose, a place where they would decompose quietly, returning to the earth without ceremony or memory. Frank Lucas returned to his penthouse, poured himself a glass of expensive scotch, and called his mother. "Mama," he said when she answered, "it's over. You can come home tomorrow. And Mama, no one will ever touch you again. I promise you that." The disappearance of Carmine Rossi and his entire crew sent shockwaves through the New York underworld that took years to fully dissipate. The NYPD opened an investigation that went nowhere. No bodies, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play beyond the simple fact that 7 men had vanished simultaneously. The official file eventually classified it as suspected organized crime dispute, perpetrators unknown. The Genovese family, as Frank had predicted, quietly distanced themselves from Rossi, allowing the rumor to circulate that he'd gotten ambitious and paid the price at the hands of a rival family. No one wanted a war with Frank Lucas, especially not over a captain who had been stupid enough to provoke one. The real impact, however, was psychological. Frank Lucas had done something unprecedented in the history of organized crime. He had made 7 men disappear so completely that their fate became the subject of urban legend. Some claimed they'd been fed to pigs upstate. Others insisted they'd been buried in the foundation of a new building in Jersey City. A few whispered that they'd been dumped in the ocean, weighted down, and gone forever. The truth remained known only to Frank Lucas and a handful of his most trusted associates. And that uncertainty, that profound not knowing, was more terrifying than any public execution could ever be. From that point forward, Frank Lucas operated with an untouchable status that transcended mere wealth or power. He had demonstrated that he possessed resources and capabilities that went far beyond the traditional gang warfare of the streets, that he could deploy military-grade operations, execute complex plans with perfect precision, and make people disappear without a trace. Most importantly, he had established an absolute non-negotiable boundary. His family was sacred, and the price for violating that sanctity wasn't death. It was something far worse. It was complete, total, terrifying erasure from existence. Eva Lucas lived the rest of her life in peace, never experiencing another moment of disrespect or danger. She passed away quietly in 1985, surrounded by family, unaware that her son had reshaped the entire criminal landscape of New York City in response to a single moment of violence against her. And somewhere in the city, in a warehouse that no longer exists, in a file that was never officially created, the names Carmine Rossi, Mickey Calabrese, Joey Mancini, Paulie Torino, Sal Benedetto, Tommy Greco, and Frankie Batts remain frozen in time. 7 men who learned too late that some boundaries should never be crossed and some mothers should never be touched. The lesson, written in silence and absence, remains unspoken but universally understood. You do not touch Frank Lucas's family. Ever.